Good evening and welcome to the 416th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture-story Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series on comics, animation, illustration, and other text image work. It's funded by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation and the New School. And this is a special Will Eisner Week 2025 event. Will Eisner's The Spirit at 85, Reflections on a Milestone. And our moderator tonight is Danny Fingeroth. Danny was a longtime editor and writer at Marvel Comics and is chair of Will Eisner Week. That's an annual celebration that we're in the midst of right now of comics, graphic novel literacy, free speech, and the legacy of Will Eisner, with events happening at more than 100 venues, live and online around the world. Danny has lectured frequently on Eisner's life and career and conducted an in-depth interview with Will Eisner in 2003 that was reprinted in M. Thomas Inge's Will Eisner Conversations. With Denis Kitchen, Danny co-curated the 2011 Will Eisner's New York exhibition at the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art. Danny is the author of several books, including Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee, and most recently, Jack Ruby, The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin. And here's Danny to introduce the panelists. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Look, Mort Gerberg, direct from, you still in New York, Mort, or you back in Colorado?
Oh, I'm back.
You back
I'm
in
back. I'm
Colorado? I,
still
I tell,
unpacking though.
huh?
I'm still unpacking.
Uh,
But of course, it's like 60 degrees here. As
right.
you remember, last week it was freezing in New York. Anyway,
I could tell by the mountains and streams in the background that you were in Colorado.
oh
So
yeah, you got it.
thanks,
Okay.
everybody. This is, you may have heard there's some stuff going on in the country and the world. So thank you for taking the time from doom scrolling to join us here. It's Will Eisner Week, a worldwide celebration. Um, I can't imagine that anybody here doesn't know who Will Eisner is, but I think I ought to just read a little about him in case any of you have had sudden trauma to the head and have forgotten. But Will Eisner, 1917 to 2005, was raised in the tenement Bronx of the Great Depression. He was a pioneer in the creation of comics of the golden age of the 30s and 40s, achieving immortality with his noir crime-fighting superhero, the Spirit, the first character to star in a comics insert distributed in newspapers. At one time or another, just about every comics great of his own and succeeding generations worked with and for Eisner. The Spirit debuted in June 1940, so this year, and tonight specifically, we're celebrating the character's 85th birthday. When The Spirit ceased publication in 1952, Eisner devoted himself to producing educational and instructional comics. Then in 1978, Eisner reinvented himself and the medium with his graphic novel, A Contract with God, the first of a series of works focused, for the most part, on early 20th century Jewish life in America. Eisner was, as Paul Levitz calls him, the champion of the graphic novel, forever spreading the word about the power and value of what he called sequential art. Comics' highest honors, the Eisner Awards, are named after him. Um, so, in case you didn't know, now you know. A bunch of you, I think, have Eisner Awards, um, given to you by Will Eisner, probably. So I have some video I'm going to show, as I said. One is from some anonymous thing I found on YouTube that seemed to work in rehearsal. That'll be about 5 or 6 minutes. And then I interviewed Jules Pfeiffer in 2017 for Eisner Centennial, and I'm going to play that too. With Jules talking about working on the Spirit. So nothing could possibly go wrong here with this technology. Let's see. I am sharing. No, you're not seeing it, right? Or are you?
No, not yet.
Up, share. Okay, here we go. Um, is it showing up? It is. Sorry, folks. It did work in rehearsal. Let us share. Unbelievable. Dan, what am I doing wrong?
I don't know. Oh, there it is. That's
Oh,
the
there it is.
slideshow.
Okay. Slideshow? No, it's
Oh, no, that's the video. Sorry. That's it.
here we go, I think.
And if everybody could mute themselves, it would probably sound better.
I'm not hearing, is anybody hearing sound? I'm not hearing sound from.
Unmuted there in the left corner.
But Dennis Kitchen came over to me and asked me, Sterling called me to revive when the spirit began to revive in the 70s. My astonishment when Phil Suling called me up and asked me to come down to attend a convention, the first convention in New York. And I found that there were people there who were reading the spirit. I remember Dennis Kitchen came over to me and asked me if he could reprint spirit stories. I said, you really want to do that? He said, yeah. I said, well, who'd be interested? The character's been dead. He's been in a box for the last 20 years. I must confess, it's a very rewarding thing. It's not every cartoonist or artist who can see a character that he created or see something he created survive to another generation. The Street was an anti-hero because I never took the whole idea of a superhero seriously. The fact that he wore a mask was a concession I made much against my better judgment, really my instinctive desire to deal with the hero. I was looking for realism in my stories. Actually, the spirit stories were stories in which the spirit only played a part of it, rather than the story built around any particular strengths that he might have. Represented a marvelous opportunity for settings. Many of the stories I did used the waterfront almost as a key to the total story. Generally, the prime action, the denouement of the story occurred on the waterfront for me because here is where the criminals were either caught entering or escaping. And the waterfront represented that throughout the whole. I guess if you would want to summarize the position of the waterfront in all the spirit stories I ever did, you might say that it was the entrance staging area for most of the adventure stories. My orientation is essentially theater, that is live theater and stage set. My father was, after all, a scenery painter, and my earliest impressions, theatrical impressions at any rate, came from live theater and remained with me throughout. I'm probably more influenced by my memory of theater than I am of film, because film is, after all, not really connected with a closed-in scene. It doesn't have the feel and the smell of a contained dimension. By introducing the weather elements like rain, extreme rain, or fog or snow, I can enhance the element of danger and bring to the reader a greater element of personal contact. It enables me to reach the reader a little bit more easily, emotionally. The city has influenced my lighting, my thinking of lighting and containment tremendously. I always thought of light coming from above. All my experience has been in the city, in narrow streets where your source of light was either a lamppost or a light of the sunshine filtered down through the space between two buildings or an alley.
So that was Eisner in '86, apparently. Does anybody know what that was done for? Dennis, do you know, or Paul?
No, no, I've never seen it.
It just showed up on YouTube, and let me see. So that was Eisner himself, and now I have this interview I did with Pfeiffer, camera work and editing by my wife Varda Steinhardt. She's available for freelance video work if you're looking. And let me deftly and smoothly get this thing working. Okay. Yep, you're not seeing it, right? Okay. I think I'm getting the hang of it. Good. Or not. Let's see. We're not seeing Jules Pfeiffer, are we?
If you have the window with Jules Pfeiffer open up, you got it.
Got it?
That looks like you got it. Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. I knew it all along. I'm just trying to build suspense.
One of the things that was so relevant and constant with Eisner in the years that I worked for him was that he drew into the office at all hours young people who were, entering the game or been in the game and making a break in the game, and he was a magnet. And since I was a kid in the office at the same age of these people, or just a bit younger, there I was when Harvey Kurtzman came in and started hanging around, and he was nobody. And Wally Wood came in and started hanging around, and he was nobody. And there were others, and it was these guys just loved to be in the atmosphere of Eisner's office. They loved to talk to Will. They loved to talk to me and everybody. They just loved to be in that venue, in that atmosphere. And they knew, despite the people in his office who didn't know, except for me, how important this guy was and how important he was to them and what an influence. I mean, at the time that I met Harvey, he was doing Hey Look. That was the only thing he ever did. But when he started a few years later to do his combat series, and you could see the influence of Will's layouts and how Harvey evolved into his own very original and very striking style. It all began with Will, and Will set him off. And he did that with just about everybody he touched. And I'm not even sure Will understood that or knew that. He just liked to talk comics with young people. He never talked comics with his staff. One of the reasons he hired me, even though I had none of the talents that he needed, was that he could talk comics with me, that I knew a lot of stuff and I knew his stuff, and I loved the business, and I was a fan, and he was a fan. Actually, I remember that drawing. This was not originally the Spirit. This was John Law, a character that Will was trying to sell and didn't. So he put a mask on him, and there we have it. So I remember that much. And I just opened the first story that I wrote.
What amazing coincidence.
Well, it just happened, 10 minutes.
That's the first story you wrote?
That was the first story I wrote.
That's pretty good for a first story.
Well, I had listened to a lot of radio, and all I tried to do was kind of write, not my version of a Spirit story, although I wanted to do that, but kind of do an adaptation of the then very popular radio show Suspense.
Mm-hmm.
And And by that time, in many of the Spirit stories, the Spirit was a walk-on. There were little short stories in which Eisner created other characters and other things and other incidents, and the Spirit might have been there in the beginning and to mop up at the end. He was kind of the host, the way Ronald Reagan did Death Valley days, and and that's exactly what happens in the story of 10 Minutes, which was written about my Bronx neighborhood with my Bronx neighbors in it, including the guy in the candy store who got shot because I always hated that guy. and that's the way you get back at things. When I was writing The Spirit and I got mad at Eisner because I felt ignored or overlooked or put down, all of which no doubt I deserved, I would get The Spirit beaten up terribly in the story.
So you had one story where
that the crap was not bad of him, and that would make me feel much better about the whole thing. But the remarkable thing about Will as an employer is that he never pulled rank or seldom pulled rank. You were co-equals, and when we talked back and forth about story, what I had to say had just as much meaning as what he had to say. And there was no ego or sense of superiority involved in the back and forth in the office that I found. It was with him and with Abe Koenigson, who was doing the lettering during my later stay. It was just back and forth, utilitarian conversation about the form, about what works best here. Everybody's contribution was respected, and things were accepted or rejected, not on the basis of who the boss was, but about what made sense. So in the turning out of the work, there was very little ego or authorial control. Bill was just wanting to turn out the best product, and he didn't care who contributed to it. He has more than one legacy. He brought a respect for story into the comic book form that simply didn't exist. He brought a level of storytelling, visual storytelling, that prior to him was only seriously connected to the work of Milton Caniff and Terry and the Pirates. The two of them, they were not the only two great storyteller cartoonists, but they were the only two great visual storyteller cartoonists who were affected by the movies and put movies on paper, and knew how to use silence, and knew how to use drama, and knew how to use theatricality in their own separate and different ways, but both of them learning totally from cinema and brilliantly using the form to invent a new way of seeing a comic strip. And when I graduated just not too many years ago into doing my own graphic novels, I found that, and I still find, working in the form as I do now, that I'm still learning from what the lessons I learned from those years working with Will. And more than ever, because I'm working for the first time in these years since I've been 80, in something akin to Will's form, which is very different from what I was doing earlier on. That while I work in that form, there's no way of ignoring his contribution. And as I've said a number of times, every time I do a page, I find him sitting on my shoulder, and it would be unable. I'd be unable to work in his form and expand it and do the things I want without him being there whispering in my ear.
So that was Jules Feiffer at the youthful age of 88 in 2017. He, between then and his recent death in January, about a week before his what would have been his 96th birthday, I think he turned out probably another 1,000 pages of comics, which is pretty good, including the three-part Kill My Mother trilogy, and he had just finished an autobiographical, like 350-page graphic. I mean, it was similar to Eisner in the sense that when Eisner was what 87 when he passed away. so really young. But each of those guys, I don't know about you, but I just felt like, oh, what a shock! You know, they were still producing. I thought they'd keep producing work, and I thought I'd get to see them again. Because they never stopped. They never let they never let physical illness or any kind of um, adversity stop them. So it's pretty great inspiration. And now, anyway, so the evening is going to be. I've asked some very accomplished, very smart people um, to read and to talk about their favorite spirit stories. So maybe I should introduce them alphabetically. Hailing from Portland, Oregon, is Susan Kirtley. Susan, you just beat Denis Kitchen out by one letter. You're KIR and he's KIT, but you won. It took me longer than it should have to figure out who goes first in that alphabetizing. But Susan Kirtley is professor of English and the director of comic studies at Portland State University. Her research interests include visual rhetoric and graphic narratives, and she has published pieces on comics for the popular press and academic journals. She's the author of the Eisner-winning Linda Barry. See, I'm going to be the only one not Eisner winning on this panel. She's the author of the Eisner-winning Linda Barry, Girlhood Through the Looking Glass, and co-editor of With Great Power Comes Great Pedagogy, Teaching, Learning, in Comics from 2020. Her book, Typical Girls, The Rhetoric of Womanhood in Comic Strips, was the 2022 Charles Hatfield Prize winner for the best book in comics studies. She is currently the editor of Inks, the Journal of the Comics Studies Society. By the way, if you think this voice is fascinating and delightful, I've done the reading for all the audio books. So imagine there's like 60 hours of this voice potentially that you could get anyway. Denis Kitchen, a pioneer underground cartoonist, founded Kitchen Sink Press. That's a lucky coincidence that your name and the press had the same Kitchen Sink Press from 1969 to 99, and the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which started in 1986. Kitchen Sink published the work of Will Eisner beginning in 1972, encompassing over 100 spirit comic books, another 30 spirit magazines, and nearly 20 books and graphic novels, including 2 Best of Spirit collections and A Contract with God. In the late 90s, Kitchen became Will Eisner's exclusive art agent, and later, with his agency partner Judith Hansen, also the literary agent for Eisner. Since 2005, the agencies have represented his estate. Paul Levitz, his L comes after K, is the author of Will Eisner, Champion of the Graphic Novel from Abrams, and published the Spirit Archives and several of Eisner's graphic novels while publisher of DC Comics. He is a member of the Eisner Hall of Fame for his contributions to comics as a writer, editor, and executive. Welcome, Paul. Patrick McDonnell's syndicated comic strip Mutts is celebrating its 30th anniversary. He is a Caldecott honor-winning children's book author, For Me, Jane, and a New York Times best-selling author. He recently worked with Marvel for his graphic novel, The Superhero's Journey, and collaborated with the Dalai Lama for the book Heart to Heart. What was the profit split in that? And Donald's most recent
It's a crazy small world.
He was.
I said it's a very crazy small world.
That's a panel all on its own. McDonnell's most recent book is Breaking the Chain, a collection of his newsworthy comics about freeing the Mutts character guard dog. Welcome, everybody. And Ben read my lengthy. Paul, we owe you some introduction words because everybody else went long. You were the only one I enforced the 50 words or less. You gave me a very succinct biography.
Hi.
I have some background questions about Eisner and the Spirit, but maybe we should just go to actually read some of these stories already. We've been talking about it for half an hour. And so here I will, let's see. Now, what are we seeing now?
Nothing.
Nothing yet.
Oh, okay. How about now?
There you go.
All right. So, chronologically, in order of publication, we have Little Adam. So, Dennis, do you want to read it? Do you want to talk about it? A little of both? What's
Well,
your...
there's a lot of verbiage in it. I want to say I love this story on just every level. First of all, it's drawn in 1947, which I think 47 and 48 were the peak of the strip. It's certainly when Will himself was still doing most of the penciling and inking, and this is a gorgeous example. Jules mentioned movie influence. I think we see here in the first three panels, seems to me an homage to Orson Welles and Citizen Kane with the camera panning into the skylight. And of course, it's it's during what Harvey Kurtzman called an Eisenspritz. Um, and then in the fourth panel, we see slumped over his drawing board is the cartoonist Al Slap, who's just been murdered. And of course, Al Slap is Al Cap, the creator of Little Abner, who here is called Little Abner, the stupid mountain boy.
Little Adam, the stupid mountain boy?
Yeah, didn't I say that? No. Oh,
It said Abner, but
oh. So next page. So one of the things I love about this is there are little industry in jokes. So besides Al Cap being pilloried here, we see the syndicate head who's complaining to Dolan and the spirit that whoever murdered his very valuable cartoonist needs to be brought to justice. And so, and you see the spirit here really doesn't want to be involved. He's ready to go on a fishing trip. It's the only time I recall in the strip that the spirit was a fisherman. But I guess even heroes need to take vacations, right? So,
the heroes.
yeah. Go to the next page. So we're introduced here to yet another cartoonist. We have he's called um, Elmer Hay, but really it's Harold Gray, of course, the creator of Little Orphan Annie. And so you see in his studio, his very lush studio, some of the characters with all the hollow eyeballs, of course. But I love the detail in the first panel. Will, always was a master of light and darkness. So you see this beautifully silhouetted panel. And then the next panel, you see through the skylight again at an angle. The next panel with the spirit's eyes in dark shadow as he's reading a comic. And then even the close-up of the doorknob. These are just all pure Eisner. And so he's interviewing Elmer Hay as a suspect, of course. And next page, we see one of the characters attacking the spirit, and of course excuse the phone. Of course the hollow eyes are quickly covered up with ink. So you get another cartoonist in joke, not only the Harold Gray characters with hollow circle eyes, but another character blinding them basically with just dabs of ink. So I love that in joke. And again, you get the lovely use of black and white with the face of Daddy Warbucks with just the eyeball showing. And again, just to me, this is brilliant cartooning. Next page, um, we have terrific, again, angular shots where the camera view is going from a bird's eye view an interior scene, bird's eye of an exterior scene, and then you get a worm's eye view, and then a serious bird's eye view, all within one page. And again, this is what's masterful about Will. And a lot of this, keep in mind if you're not aware, this just was instinctive for Will. He didn't have reference material for the most part. He just drew this freehand. He knew exactly what these angles look like. He knew the architectural detail inside and out. And, um, even I love the next to the last panel. We have the bars on the window, which was another trademark of his with the crossed iron bars, and the dog howling in the last panel. And we go to the next page. You have now he's going into the studio of Hector Gould, which of course is Chester Gould. Chester Gould created, of course, Dick Tracy. And the other in joke, since this is Little Adam is Little Abner, what Al Cap did for many years was he had a strip within a strip called Fearless Fosdick. And Fearless Fosdick was a parody of Dick Tracy. So the layers of in jokes here are wonderful. The other thing I love about this page is that center tier where you actually have a so-called example of Dick Tracy. That is drawn by Jules Pfeiffer. Everything else in this story is by Eisner, except for the Fearless Fosdick. So that's another little way. I think perhaps Eisner was knowing Jules would enjoy drawing it, but also it provides a little bit of a stylistic break because it does look like a simpler style. And so then you see Little Adam and I'm sorry, Al Slap himself in a flashback, and the the billboard at the end in Central City. Nearly everyone reads Fearless Fuznik. And again, all of these strips were enormously popular in the 40s, as I'm sure the listeners and panelists know. So the promotion of these strips was a given. Next page. So here we have basically the suspect Chester Gould admitting that he killed him out of jealousy and out of resentment that his own strip was continually being parodied. And then we flash to Al Slap in a hospital bed. It turns out he wasn't murdered after all. He's alive and well. But in the next to last panel, he's punched through a door dramatically. And we see the one who punched him was Pappy Yoakum, of course, one of the stars in Little Abner. He's Little Abner's father. So every element of this to me is wonderful, from the peak drawing style to all the industry in jokes. And there's also a wonderful backstory to this, which is Al Cap certainly in his entire career was more famous than Will Eisner was until later years. And they were both members of the National Cartoonist Society, though not close. At one of the meetings, Al Cap approached Will and he made a proposal. Cap periodically would parody other comic strips in Little Abner. Probably the best known one was he did a parody of Mary Worth that he called Mary Worm. And when he did that, the Ken Ernst and Saunders, the artist, reciprocated by doing a parody of Little Abner, or actually Cap himself. And in Mary Worth, who was kind of a gossipy, do-good old lady. The cartoonist Al Cap is presented there as a drunkard. That was the way they got back at him. And in reality, Cap was a teetotaler. But what was revealed only later, because readers wouldn't have known at the time, that was concocted. Both cartoonists knew they were going to parody each other just to get a publicity stunt. So when Cap approached Will and said, I'll tell you what, you parody my strip and I'll parody yours. And Will thought, well, this is great. We'll get a lot of publicity out of this. This will be a wonderful boost. Plus, he was an admirer of Cap. So that's how he came to create Little Adam. The final irony is that Newsweek got wind of this, probably through Cap's publicist, and Newsweek did a nice article about this parody. And instead of being, though, an article principally about Will, it was mainly on Cap because he was the more famous of the two. And the final irony or the final indignity is that Al Cap never reciprocated. So I love that story.
You wrote Cap's biography, right?
Yes, I did. I know way too much about that fellow who was, I would say, to sum it up, a genius of a cartoonist and a snake of a human being.
Well, nobody's perfect.
Nobody's perfect.
So I have two sort of comments, or that second panel where the Gould character is getting punched in the face. That looks like it has to be an homage to something. It's too. It's almost out of character with the rest of the story. It's almost as. Anybody have any idea? It looks almost like Smiling Jack to me or something. But that something about that panel stands out. And I love what you said about Mary Worth being an old lady, because if you look at the strip, I have a feeling she's probably like 52. You know, right? It reminds me of a story that I'll tell the short version, but of that Al Jaffe used to tell about him and Erwin Hazen out at dinner, and they realize what they call this old couple is sitting next to them eavesdropping, and so they make up this horrible story about I think that Al had lost his temper with his wife or girlfriend, and he goes into graphic detail about how he murdered her, and they describe these quote unquote old people at the next table being scandalized. And so when it came time for the Q&A, Al was about 95 or 96 at this point. And I said to him, Al, when you say the people at the next table were old, what do you mean? Well, they were in their 50s or 60s, So thank you, Dennis. I will move on to Paul Levitz and the story of Gerhard Schnabel.
Thank you, Danny. So this has always been a favorite because, first of all, it was one of Will's self-described favorites of his own work. But it struck me in reading it, and in reading it in the context of where it fits in the evolution of Will's career, that in many ways it's really an autobiographical story. By the time the Gerhard Schnabel story is on the drawing board, Will is arguably doing better work than anyone in the field. He's at the very least tied with the very best cartoonists in America, working, whether we're talking about the comic strips. Really wasn't anyone of his caliber, I think, working regularly in the comic books. Maybe Jack Cole on a very, very good day. One or two of the other guys. Harvey hadn't really started at this point. So it's a story of a man who can fly and summons up the courage to do it, and no one notices. And I think that's what Will was feeling. I had that discussion many years later, of course, with Jules about it. And Jules had not had that feeling at the time the story was going on, but he was quite in agreement with the read of it. There's a couple of things that we haven't said about Will that I think are important. One is that when you look at this body of work that we're showing off, what's missing is the comparison to what the state of the art was in the field at the time. And we look at work like the story Dennis just showed panel by panel. It stands up with the best of what is being done decades later in terms of thinking and execution of comics. But when we measure it with our current eyes, we measure it against what we know has been accomplished. When you measure it against what was being done at that moment, it's far more extraordinary. Will isn't inventing all of these techniques. Some he's borrowing from other media. The film influence was talked about. Will talked about his own influence from the Yiddish theater and theater in general. But he's putting these tools together so far before everybody else was doing it. And he knows he's doing it, and he knows this is all coming together and that he's flying in it. And I think part of why what Jules was talking about, Will's joy in talking with the young people who were wandering in. When you listen to that litany of young people, and you see it was people like Woody, people like Harvey, these weren't just young people. These were raw geniuses. These were people who would take inspiration from Will's work, be able to discuss it in very intelligent fashion, and then go on to find their own voices in ways that were every bit his equal in genius. I think Will's sense that he was a genius at the time of Schnabel was a very sad sense at heart. He was getting pressure from family to get an honest job. He was seeing the challenges to the economics of the spirit already. It was still a very successful business model in these years in the late 40s, but he's a very smart man. He saw the writing on the wall that this was not going to turn into one of the great commercial successes of syndication because of the format it was delivered in. And I think his soul was a Schnabel soul at that moment. And he was beginning to try to decide, well, if I fly and nobody's applauding, should I even be trying to fly, or should I find another trick to do? Let's flip the pages quickly, Danny, if you would. You also see things like this, the use of montage, extraordinarily rare technique for the time, the integration of the lettering in a fashion that the lettering's motion was helping tell the story. Let's take another one. There's drama, there's humor. Schnabel is fired. Look at the body language there. Look at the simple dynamics of what's going on there.
He wouldn't have been out of place in Mad Magazine, would he?
It would not. It would have been with the highest of Mad Magazine, but Mad wouldn't be there for another 6 years from this. I'm doing the math right in my head.
Yeah.
That's not to say that Harvey looked at this and said, this is how I must express this emotion. They were drawing on a great deal of commonality of knowledge, but they also were drawing on those conversations. And I think that's something we underestimate. And let's follow poor Mr. Schnabel. Again, we have that use of photorealism, rare in the spirit and even rarer in any other form of comics. Going up to the roof. He remembers his power to fly, and off he goes. Next. Look at that perspective. Look at the power of that. I'm not an artist like Dennis or Patrick. I can't begin to imagine how you capture that and take it out, pluck it out of your mind's eye and build it effectively. But that's as rare a shot of a man leaping into flight as I've seen anybody ever pull off in comics. Next.
Well, I think we know several people who've made careers out of that one panel.
Or aspiring to it. And here's poor Gerhard's one flight and following it. Next and last. Final flight of Gerhard Schnabel. And no one even suspected that on this day, Gerhard Schnabel had flown. And nobody suspected that Will Eisner thought he had flown.
Huh. I love that perspective, Paul. That's great.
You
know, Paul, based on that theory, that first page where he went out of his way to say, this is not a funny story, takes on a powerful.
Yeah.
And you could also see Will almost saying, yeah, I could draw Superman if I wanted, but I don't want
to. Probably. Well, I don't think Will never had a great deal of respect for the art of Superman. I remember those conversations well. But
Superman in particular, or superheroes in general?
Superman in particular. I remember, perhaps because of what I did for a living, but I remember having the conversations with Will where it was sort of, it just wasn't such a big idea. Somebody else would have had it 2 minutes later. I don't know why everybody makes such a big deal of it.
Paul, I remember a story you told me shortly after you started publishing the Spirit Archives, where you told Will that the first volume of the Spirit had outsold the first volume of Superman, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And Will's reaction was, I knew if they ever had a head-to-head matchup, the Spirit would beat the shit out of Superman.
He was a proud man, but he had an awful lot to be proud of.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I think it was he always would say it was his favorite. I think his take on it, or what he was willing to say publicly, was that it was where he first saw that comics could be a vehicle for personal expression. That doesn't, that sounds like a nice sound bite, but I think he figured that out long before.
Yeah. I mean, obviously what we're doing is we're doing psychiatry or psychology, literally a generation later.
Somebody ought to write a book like that. Oh, wait a minute.
Back to you, Danny. Next up.
Thank you, Paul. Next is Patrick with with an eyeball, but no.
Well, first, let me start by saying what an impossible task you gave us to pick one favorite Will Eisner story for so many reasons. I must admit, I don't think I've read every Will Eisner story. That's my fault. I've read every Crazy Cat, and like Crazy Cat, I think Will's batting average was amazing. I mean, there were so many great stories to choose from. And just a little background on me, I was lucky and blessed enough to have Will Eisner as a teacher when I went to the School of Visual Arts. And he was a great man and definitely a great teacher. And I have to say, he was the only teacher in all my years at SVA that wore a suit and tie to class. And, he was that unique individual that had the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. He was an artist, but he was a great businessman too. And I think he taught me not only about art, but just the business of doing comic strips. And the greatest thing he did for the class, and I'm sure most of you know this, that at the end of his class, he had us produce a comic book, the SVA gallery. So, one of my first printed pieces was to have a comic and a Will Eisner comic book. So, just a great guy. So,
who else was in school with you at that time?
Excuse me?
Who else was in school with you at that time?
Well, in the issue I'm in, the SVA gallery is Ray Billingsley of Curtis comic strip fame, Bat and Lash. I don't know if you guys know Joe Coleman, but a great fine painter now, Joe Coleman, started out doing comic strips. So, it was a really fun class doing fun stuff, and Will was the perfect teacher for it.
I'll call you back, Will. I'm watching something. Bye.
So, the strip of the pages I picked were the Deadly comic book, and what I love about this particular story, it's a comic about reading comics, and right off the bat, you can identify with the lead character because it's like it's an eyeball reading the spirit. If you look at this first page, it has all the classic film noir stuff that Will was so great at: the heavy blacks, the great shading. And I love this. It's a story of a music teacher, and including in this story is a metronome, and adding the sound of the tick tock and the tension and time, the element of time with this metronome constantly tick tocking throughout this story. You can do the next page. So it's about this music teacher who walks by, and another one of the teachers is doing his weekly comic book burning, and the teacher picks up one of the comics that didn't end up in the fire, and of course he thinks he's immune to these silly stories, so he's reading this horror detective story, and as he's reading it, he's getting caught up in it and thinking he's above it, but starting to get nervous and rushes to his office. And on the metronome is a threatening letter that he wants his comic book. Somebody wants their comic book back. And what I love about that is to have that note on the metronome. So now time has stopped. It's no longer tick-tock, and his life has changed. And turn the page. If you could turn the page, yeah. So now he takes the note, and now the metronome's back to ticking. And he rushes to the police office with this threat. And because of reading the comic, he's more nervous than ever that the world's a dangerous place. And then in these next panels, again with the film noir, to now have a rainstorm just to add to the mood and tension of the piece. And what's great here is Dolan starts talking about how horrible comics are and how they're fantasy and don't tell things realistically. And what's nice about here, and I think it was on purpose, they're crossing an old bridge. And I got the feeling that was them talking about that they crossed a bridge into elevating comics. Next page. So this is the action scene, but what's wonderful about this action scene is Dolan's complaining about how unrealistic and exaggerated comic books are with their fighting scenes and how ridiculous it is. And cops really do brain work, and it's not like all this stuff. So he's literally, as he's complaining, doing everything he's complaining about, which is just a great setup. Next page. So of course they're still complaining about the comics, but at this point they captured the villain. And what I love is that middle panel is so nonchalantly how the spirit just knocks them out, and with no effort and force at all. And of course Dolan gets there too late. Next page. So now we're back to the professor in his office, and he's silly enough to read another comic because he thinks it's not going to affect him. And of course, as he's reading it, he gets more and more nervous that this murderer is out to get him. what's great about that, we're reading about someone who might get in trouble. So just that always being connected to this guy. So next page. So he finally confronts in the dark is the guy who threatened his life. And it's all done behind closed doors. You hear the pow and the crash. And as the door opens, you see this little kid taking his comic strip back. So these awful comics are still for kids. And just a thought of mine, but that kid looks an awfully lot alike the kid that's on the first cover of Mad Magazine. I don't know if there's any connection there, but boy, he sure looks a lot like the kid that's on that Mad Magazine cover.
That's a figure you see a lot. I wonder does anybody know the origin of that little kid figure? It's a commonly seen thing. Patrick, can I make a couple of comments? I don't want to step on your presentation.
No, sure. Go. The only last thing I was going to say is after I picked this, I did a little research Googling about it, and I hadn't known, but it was listed as a comic that Will and Jules Pfeiffer did. So that was nice to know that Jules was part of this. And it's just amazing you think how powerful a combination and creativity Jules Pfeiffer and Will Eisner. I mean, it's amazing that happened, and we got to be blessed looking at this stuff.
Well, a third person is Abe Canixon. All these stories we looked at, the lettering is so much a part of. It's part of the story, but it doesn't detract from the story. But it's so much a part of the visual language of Eisner. It's interesting, I guess Wortham's book, Seduction of the Innocent, came out in '54, but there were anti-comics crusades starting in 1940. Because one thing I remember from Wortham's book, from Seduction of the Innocent, and really from my years working in mainstream comics at Marvel, was the injury to the eye motif. This was a thing that drove psychiatrists and teachers crazy. That there's that story called "Murder, Morphine, and Me" that Wortham talks about. That opens with a woman being threatened. Her eye is a hypodermic needle about to puncture her eye, and so I think this is an inside joke. And I love Eisner showing off here. Oh yeah, it's a silent medium, but I'll still make you hear the metronome.
Mm-hmm.
No problem. You're gonna still hear the tick tock, even though there's no sound. And just you were saying, I don't know if probably this company, the people here have read every Spirit story, but there were 52 Spirit stories for 12 years. I can't even. That's a lot of.
There were about 640 or so.
You okay? Well, so there were ones I probably read when they first came out in Dennis's or in Warren's, way and read them, but there was just the best of volume that Pfeiffer was holding in that video. There's got to be 100 or more in that. So even if you've read them at some point, there's a lot of them. Thank you, Patrick. Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Susan, I can't see you somehow the way it's configured.
Okay. I'm here.
Oh, okay, good.
I'm ready to roll. Thank you. Thanks thank you. Thanks for allowing me to be part of this esteemed panel. I approached Will Eisner as a scholar and as an instructor. I did not know him, so it's so exciting for me to get to hear these inside stories. So I really appreciate all of these insights and stories. I chose 10 minutes for my piece. And as I said, I approach it as an instructor. And I really think this is, whenever I teach comics, I have to teach something by Will Eisner for obvious reasons. And this is a great story, I think, in that it shows his willingness to collaborate, as well as his enthusiasm for experimentation and his ability to deliver suspense in this time-bound narrative. I also, as many of us are, I'm feeling the loss of Jules Feiffer, and as referenced in that interview, this is one of his, his first collaboration, his first story. So it seemed appropriate to honor him as well, and it was great to see that video with Pfeiffer talking about this strip and also about Eisner's legacy and influence. Because whenever I teach with Eisner, I think the students, he has such an impact and an influence, and it's wonderful to have my students reading his work and being exposed to his genius. And this is a great story that I like to use. 10 minutes it's the spirit is barely in the story, as Pfeiffer pointed out. It's really the story of this desperate, angry young man, Freddie. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I wanted to just break down these first few panels that we're seeing right now, because the narration begins. I love this. It will take you 10 minutes to read the story, a very short time in any man's life. And then you see there's the introduction. He said this is his town. You see the steps. We see Freddie's stoop. There's various men and boys lounging around. One of them in the bottom left is wearing a cowboy hat and reading a comic. There's a little girl bouncing a ball, doing a little chant. You can see in the back Freddie. And then we see, the second panel, it says it's a very short time in any man's lifetime. And we get the sense that, Freddie is emerging from the doorway. This also shows off the ways in which Eisner's expertise in showing the character and expression through the facial expressions, the body posture. In the third panel, Freddie kicks at the little boy reading comics, which, you should never mess with anyone reading comics. This is a cardinal sin here. But we get a sense of who Freddie is in these four panels. And the narration continues, but these 10 minutes that you will spend here are an eternity for one man, for they are the last 10 minutes in Freddie's life. And I love this opening because it builds so much suspense. He's linking, we're going to read it in 10 minutes. This is a lifetime for Freddie. These are the last 10 minutes. And I also love the second person address of you will spend here, because he's directly through this text reaching out to the reader like, no, I see you. You're in here. So bringing the reader into the action. And if you don't mind skipping to the next page, we'll see this use of, in the top left, we have the time is now 10:31 and the clock, and it says tick, tick, tick. And the ticks get bigger and bolder. And there's that emphasis of time is ticking down. And I'm going to just sort of give you a brief overview of what happens. Freddie enters into this candy shop, and he decides he's playing this game, and then he decides, I've had enough. I have to get out of here. He decides to rob the store. And he ends up accidentally killing the owner, Max. If you want to keep flipping, he accidentally kills the owner. He tries to hide the owner and continue serving customers. This does not work. They discover, obviously, there's a wonderful sort of dark humor also evident in this piece. So he's like trying to hide the shop owner. He's serving the customers. They realize, hey, wait a minute, you've killed Max, the owner. So he dashes out of the store, and he's trying to run away and catch a train. If you want to skip to the next page. And interestingly enough, so here we see on this page the clock. It's 10:35, ticking, ticking, ticking down. These patrons in the store see, wait, what's happening, and realize that Max has been murdered. And you see in the bottom panel, he's running out of the store. And if you flip to the next page, again, the clock ticking, ticking, ticking. And he's trying to run away. He's going to get out of here. And again, also, as referenced before, really great use of perspective. We're building the tension. We also have this little girl in the bottom panel, that bottom right panel. She's continuing to sort of mark time by bouncing her ball. And if you go to the next page, he is trying to escape on the train, and he thinks, I'm going to take the train. And he actually drops his money in the bottom panels there, and the spirit picks it up and tries to help him, like, oops, see, you've dropped your money, sir. he's continuing to run away. And if you turn to the next page, we have this denouement where he it's a little bit hard to see because it's small, but the spirit sort of stops him and say, "Hey, can I talk to you, Freddie?" Freddie panics and sort of gets stuck in the train, and he gets caught in the train doors and is killed. And the spirit doesn't really do. There's no gunfight. This is really all Freddie is doing all of this, and the spirit's like, "Whoa, what just happened?" And then there's this wonderful final panel there on the bottom right. And the spirit and Commissioner Dolan are lamenting this death. And he says, Dolan says, "Too bad. He was only a kid." And the spirit replies, "So many of them are kids, Dolan. They break them in young around here. I wonder just when it was when Freddie started on his crime career." And we know it was 10 minutes ago. And then there's this couple in the corner arguing about being late. And the man is stating, "Honey, it's only 10:41. I'm 10 minutes late. What's 10 minutes in a man's life?" So we have this delightful sort of the promise of the opening narration is fulfilled with this sort of delicious and terrible twist at the end. How much is 10 minutes worth? Well, it's nothing, and it's everything. And I love this story because I think, again, just to reiterate, it showcases his skills. You see the perspective, you see the expressions of the characters, the building of the suspense with that ticking clock. Um, and that ominous opening the last 10 minutes of his life. And the spirit is able to act as kind of this proxy for the reader, all of us witnessing this tragedy in real time. I think it's such a compact and thoughtful and brilliant comic for students to think about when they're learning about how do I build suspense? How do I manipulate? How do I work with time? And how do I develop that pacing? And as a reader, I also love the dark humor and the ways in which you get to see Eisner experimenting with form and content. So that was my choice. 10 minutes. So thanks for letting me talk a little bit about it.
Thank you. So as somebody who's are you a native West Coaster? Are you from?
Yes.
So I mean, I just wanted to point out that maybe Freddie should not have gone into the 13th Street subway station. Maybe that was a bad idea. You know, an omen of sorts. This story is so New York and so Bronx and so 40s, so that I mean, I think it's a joint autobiography by Eisner and Pfeiffer. Did that have any impact or come through to you at all, reading it as someone from a whole other world?
Well, I knew that Pfeiffer was involved, and so I did want to choose one that had both of them represented, and I love reading Eisner and Contract with God and all of his other stories and getting to know his city through his eyes. And so I always enjoy that. And I also saw there was a mention in the chat about the short film made in 1989 called 10 Minutes. Yes, that does exist. And I have done a little research. Eisner collaborated and said yes. And he did a little bit of extra art for it. I For me, it's how you're always like, oh, the book was better than the movie. I did not enjoy the movie, but I love the attempt, the experiment. Yeah, I was just referencing the chat, but I'm back to the original question. Yes, it's live action, but they had like there's a little bit of extra art that he did sort of for the opening and closing and the advertisements, I believe.
But I mean, obviously it was relatable being from. I mean, because to me, this is maybe the ultimate New York 40s, dare I say, Jewish Bronx story, and and even the time frame. It's before I was born, but I just that kind of working class Bronx neighborhood, even though 13th Street would put it more on like the Lower East Side, but it's so I can I can those in the middle panel on that last page, when I was a kid, there were gum machines that had, you could see your reflection because behind that was, there's so much of it that is so careful. And then I'm thinking, I wonder if Krigstein, when he did Master Race, was thinking of this subway, right? That's the other big subway story is Bernard Krigstein, Master Race.
I think that's a stretch, Danny.
Huh?
I think that's a stretch, Danny.
I was going to say,
I've been known to stretch before, so yeah.
I was just going to say very briefly, I think, I teach, Eisner many years later and in Oregon on the West Coast. And I think in a lot of ways, Eisner is very, all of these specific details and yet also very universal because we relate to the feeling, like we relate to Freddie. He's fed up. We relate to, we relate to his characters and the struggles that they're going through. So I think, he's incredibly specific in all of these small details, which I think will resonate to native New Yorkers or folks from that area, but also the details of his characters and their experiences and their relationships are so widely relatable. That human element carries through across time and across generations and across place.
Thank you. Boy, what a well, and I guess I'm gonna be the last one with this. I guess the theme for good reason is Jules and Will. This it's fun. It's Happy New Year. It's also called Deadline in some other versions of it.
I thought these were in alphabetical order, Danny.
They were no. The introductions were alphabetical. The stories are chronological.
Ah.
And I think I got the chronology. This time wise. This is the. But I picked this one because Jules had just passed away. You don't have to be in comics to figure out that a story that came out December 31st, 1950, was probably written and drawn at the latest in the fall. Although who knows? Maybe given the way deadlines are and given the topic of this story, maybe it was written and drawn around Thanksgiving. But there's a lag time, so it's very funny that we're still, it opens up Eisner as sort of, written even in Mr. Eisner as if he was a celebrity, right? As if everybody should know. Although I guess Will had his name big on all the splash pages, but it's pretty brilliant. It's ambiguous panel borders, the great lettering. Anybody who's gone into their office, or been stuck at the office late knows that feeling. You sort of feel both noble and like an idiot at the same time. Like if I was any good at my job, I wouldn't be here at midnight, but here I am. But what a martyr I am being here at midnight on New Year's Eve, right? I didn't see the door opens, and of course there is a interesting play on their relationship because yes, Pfeiffer, the assistant, does come in and murder Eisner. By the same token, Eisner has not drawn Pfeiffer as an especially attractive person. So I think their mutual revenge on each other. And I'm guessing this is probably what the studio looked like. And then as will often happen with impulsive actions, what am I going to do now? But Pfeiffer, never lacking for confidence, doesn't seem to bother him that he's killed his boss or killed anybody. And there's something comical about Eisner's feet under the drawing board in that third panel. I mean, it's
yeah,
they're kind of funny dead guy feet, right? And the editor, of whatever the editor would be, whoever, I guess maybe from the syndicate. And I think there was a tradition. I was just reading there's a tradition the last few years. The last Spirit story of the year would be a recap of what had gone on. So here's Pfeiffer, although he's never named, but for years, all I've been doing is sharpening pencils, erasing pages, and drawing little children's pictures. I am better than all this. No more little children for me. I will draw a Spirit story the like of which the world has never seen. that now here's an inside gag that I don't get. Does anybody know what the cut on this line refers to? Was that a common thing in newspaper ads then or something? What would that mean?
Which word?
At the very top, cut on this line.
Oh, the spirit sections came folded. You had to have a scissors to cut them so that you could open them.
Really? Even, I mean, when you bought the paper?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't. Oh, that's interesting. I had no idea.
Have you not seen any of the original inserts?
I have one, but it doesn't have that.
Well, somebody already cut it.
Oh, okay. But that was for the newsstand dealer or for the consumer?
The consumer.
I never saw an uncut one. That's cool.
So, thank you. All
To
right.
learn stuff.
So here I must be the spirit, and I must never carry a gun, but still I must fight crime barehanded. No other crime fighter can make that stupid statement. And
Yeah.
and then, of course, he's drawing it. Pfeiffer was doing a backup strip called Clifford, which they made a Martin Short movie about 20 years ago because I guess the whole country was Clifford crazy. I don't know. Why did they make... Anyway, they made a Clifford movie. that, and it's very funny. It's done in it's done in a 20-year-old Jules Pfeiffer. How old have you been? Maybe not even 20. It's in a Pfeiffer style. And it's very funny. At last I meet the notorious sans serif. Don't be coy with me, spirit. All these years in the mask don't fool me, Denny called. You got a long memory, Sand. Oh, shut up with the sharp talk and hold me. So it's parrying and it's homaging, I guess, Bogart and Bacall and every other film noir couple. But it does, it really lampoons the spirit. In May, I got beaten up. In June, I wrestled an alligator. In July, I got stranded in the desert with a killer handcuffed to me. I got beat up. You'll move, killer, if I have to drag you every inch of the way. And they're like little little Bronx boys dragging through the desert. Then in April, I came home. Then I beat up some crooks. And then I got into some income tax trouble. But I got out of it. It's very funny. This is one of those stories I've looked at and known about for decades, but never actually read until today. It was, and it's quite witty. Came September, the return of school, and also the return of Piguel. Beautiful, desirable Piguel. Looks like you lose again, spirit. Don't you ever get tired of being outwitted by me, sweetheart? And then comes the Eisenspritz in panel 5. Except what never happens with Eisenspritz in the actual comics is that there must be a backed up sewer because it just builds up and up till it's over their heads. Then in November, there was Thanksgiving. We had a big party and we had turkey and cranberry sauce. It's like so wonderful, And then suddenly, the Pfeiffer character, I'm finished, now to mail it to the editor, which, and then suddenly the fourth wall is broken and Pfeiffer or his stand-in steps out of a couple of different panel grids. And then the panel grid exists as like a structure behind him. Now I know you. You're the one who watches every week. All you ever do is stare. This time you are part of the adventure. You can't escape, not even by turning this page. There must be no witness to what I've done. It's pretty ingenious. It's, this is a course. And then, of course, it was all a dream. Or was it? This is Eisner. This is the Syndicate. Your assistant just delivered the New Year's story to us. New Year's story? It's terrific. What an original idea. How do you ever think them up? Don't explain, boy. Just keep up the good work in 1951. Happy New Year. And then there are those statistics. For those readers who keep an annual record, we present again this year. Vital statistics on the spirit, gathered and prepared by the Eisner Research Foundation. Carl and Nancy are there. That might be an Eisner Foundation we don't hear much about, and it's got, it's kind of it's kind of brilliant, I guess most people were reading it on on New Year's Eve. So those are the 5 stories. So I will come out of the share here. So how many people are, oh, there's 22 people, but I can only see, hi, everybody. Anybody have any thoughts now that from the participants, now that you've seen all the stories? I have some general questions. Maybe Paul or Dennis, just can you give a little, I know we're doing this in reverse order, but maybe a little background on how Eisner grew up and his parents and that stuff that maybe is reflected in the stories?
I think most of the people who are here this evening know a fair amount about Will's life. If they don't, Will Eisner, champion of graphic novels, still available.
Yep.
But I think we're not in a 101 Eisner class here. We're in an advanced session.
Right.
And the interesting questions about Will, when you think about this, the importance of the spirit at 85. Most creative work has a horizon line in time because stylistically it belongs to a particular period, because it reflects a popular culture of a particular period. Not all of the spirit survives timelessly, but there's a good body of work, including a lot of what we've looked at this evening, that has that kind of immortality to it, that it stands outside time and is still something that Susan can talk about teaching. I've used in my courses as well, other people. And even beyond the teaching, that it's continued to inspire creative people to experiment in new ways. And that's one of the biggest lessons, I think, from Will's lifetime of work. What made him most extraordinary, in my view, is the career that has the two peaks. It is so rare for someone who does extraordinary work in their youth that changes an industry to then essentially disappear from public view for a couple of decades and then return with pieces of work that again change the perception of a field. And there's the rare person who is a genius at the beginning of their career. There's the rare person who matures into being a genius. It's very, very hard to find anyone with two peaks like that. And that's one of the lessons we should take from Will's life, that there is an opportunity for that, not just second act, but second act of genius.
Well, it's amazing because even people who may continue working in their whole lives and live long lives, I think we can all think of examples of artists who kept working but didn't grow or evolve. They just kept drawing the same, in 1990 they were drawing the same figure they drew in 1945, or that Eisner continued to grow and be curious about the medium and the medium's possibilities.
Yep.
Is remarkable. And I think that translated down to Pfeiffer as well. I mean, that Jules literally finished a 350-page graphic novel, and that was starting on something else. Despite having severe vision issues, he had to look at the corner of his vision to see what he was doing. I mean, it's sort of very it's almost too literary. Those two guys found each other, and maybe that was unique about how Pfeiffer and Eisner related. A lot of talented people worked for Eisner, but Pfeiffer seemed to be the one who got the most out of it. Maybe Plug did. I think Mike Plug seemed to do a lot of good work. Anybody else who came out of that with admiration for Will and saw it as more than a paycheck?
I think, I mean, I think that's true that there were other people who admired Will in that fashion, but I don't think, well, Jules is a combination of two things. One, you're clearly talking about somebody who had genius within him, right? We all, those of us who got to know Jules over the years, this was just an extraordinarily smart and talented man across a wider range of creativity than almost any human being I've ever played with. But the other thing is the age he was at when he walked into Will's life. Right. Nick Cardy walked into Will's life as a young artist. Jerry Grandinetti as I guess, just a college graduate. Both of them would go on to admire Will's work, to draw from Will's work in extraordinary artistic careers that they would have themselves. But they didn't walk in as a 16-year-old kid. You know, Jules walked in unformed. And I think the fact that Will spotted that and that whatever happened between the two of them really was uniquely possible because of that age gap too.
Hubert there, like,
yeah. Remember, Will broke into the industry as a teenager as well, so I think he could relate to young talent having been there.
What was Will's age when he invented the graphic novel?
I think 50. He was born in 1917. He started Contract with God in 77.
60.
60, yeah.
Yeah, I'd tell you that between Jules and Will, I mean, inspirational my whole life, but now at the age I am now, more inspirational than ever when I think of what Jules was doing in his 90s and what Will Eisner was doing. I mean, to come up with that in his 60s, it's just inspirational.
Well, when Steranko interviewed him for Steranko's History of Comics, he painted Will as the grand old man of comics, and he was 55.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I found interesting. I'm going to interrupt. I know I'm not one of the speakers, but I spent a fair amount of time with Will in December of 2004. I happened to just go visit him, and he, just as a fan, and his secretary said, "Mr. Eisner will see you now." And he sat down with me for about a half an hour, and we talked about lots of different comic artists. He had been reading things like Blankets. We talked about different artists and how they tell stories. He showed me his first prints of The Plot, which he had just received that week. And then after about a half an hour, he got out the newest Spirit Archives book. It was volume 12. And he said, "I don't want you to leave empty-handed." And I know what that meant. That meant, "But I want you to leave." And as it turns out, I met his nephew because his nephew and I were in the same profession. His nephew is an actuary. And turned out he worked in the same building as me, One Penn Plaza, but for a different firm. And he came up to my office once to see the prints on my wall that I had of Will's, because I had the Rumble and I had two of the prints from some of the series that were done. But he came up to talk. But it was just the time he spent with me. It was one of the first time I ever had an intelligent conversation with someone I admired so much.
It's funny you mention his nephew's profession, because in later years, Will and I would have typically an annual meeting where we would plan what he was doing over the next year, 2 or 3. And he would always start it by saying, "I checked my actuarial charts and I have 7 years." And every year, of course, it would change somewhat, but I hadn't realized that joke began with his nephew.
Well, I mean, some of those graphic novels of our family stories there. I think that a lot of them are based in real relationships and real stories, starting with
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and when he ran out of his own family, he then did Anne's family.
Very funny. Michael Dooley in the comments. Hello, Michael. Mentioned, he says, invented the graphic novel is debatable. I don't know if Will ever claimed that he invented it. I think, Paul, you had your term, champion of the graphic novel. We call him innovator, pioneer, evangelist.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's hard to define the border of what the graphic novel is, which makes it even more difficult to decide who invented it. You want to make the argument back to the wordless books. The argument I make in the Champion book is that the closest thing we have to the first modern graphic novel, and what I like to teach as the graphic novel, the idea that it attempts to be a literary thing, that real literature should be about the human condition, should be about the things that we wonder about: mortality, morality. Is Harvey's Jungle Book. But that sparks nothing following it as a failed experiment.
That's right. One of the ones that I point to. The Jungle Book is one that I point to. I just typed in Franz Massereel and Lind Ward in there, going back even, and
Right.
There are all sorts of other examples, but and the Jungle Book shares the commonality of it. Rather than being a graphic novel, it's 4 short stories, as was Eisner's contract with God, had the connection of the apartments. So we read more of his 4 short stories with a whole. But the interesting thing about it, I mean, speaking about Pfeiffer, it was a year after Contract with God, the 4 short stories came out, that Jules Pfeiffer's Tantrum came out, which was...
It's even closer than that, Dan. I think they came out very close to simultaneously.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so so you've got that. So hats off to Jules Pfeiffer, who, I mean, it wasn't quite the graphic novel length of the Kill My Mother series, but but still. So there were things around, and there are all sorts of examples of that. But
Yep.
just kind of it's one of those blankets. He is certainly the popularizer, Eisner. There's no denying that. He knew he knew how to sell. Putting graphic novel on the cover worked, whether it was a graphic novel or that or not, and he had popularized it, and so it was. It was it was part of a time. Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway,
well, it was not the first, but it was the first successful graphic novel that changed the industry. That's what I think is distinctive. And to get back to Jungle Book for a moment, every reference seems to be that it was failed. It was a financial failure from the publisher's point of view. But when I finally got deep into Harvey's archives and I saw the royalty reports from Ian Ballantyne, Jungle Book sold 75,000 copies, which a lot of authors would die for today.
and that's the first printing with the crappy paper and everything.
Yeah. But the thing is, he measured success by going well into 6 figures in those days, because the Mad paperbacks, sold gazillion. And that's what Ballantyne hoped Harvey would do again.
Yeah, and it was also the birth of Goodman Beaver, so that alone deserves 5 stars out of 5.
Is that the one where he savagely attacks Martin Goodman? Is that sort of a very thinly veiled?
Yes.
Goodman ever?
Yeah.
Did anybody ever ask Goodman about that?
Yeah.
And Goodman, and just Goodman Beaver, right? So,
Yeah.
The organization man in the gray flannel executive suite.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right.
So,
One of the the top.
What Martin thought of that.
Well, yeah, and the other joke is Goodman is doing crossword puzzles, literally the checkerboards, and that was Harvey's first job working for Timely. was crossword puzzles.
They made a lot of money on those crossword puzzles.
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of commonalities between Harvey and Will that are fun to talk about.
Including they both taught at SVA, right? I mean that.
Yep.
Patrick, did you study
Indeed.
with Harvey as well?
You know, it's funny. I didn't officially take his class, but I used to hide in the back and sit in once in a while.
Yeah, Patrick was on a panel last Comic-Con about Will. The panel I put actually I didn't put together, but yeah, Mr. Fingeroth put it together, which included yeah, Patrick and others talking about those days. Yeah, credit where due. It was a Danny Fingeroth panel. I was just a
got more
moderator.
publicity getting COVID and not showing up than I would have if I had shown up. So
yeah, pinch hitter, me. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, Patrick had some great stories about Harvey at SVA. Thank you again for that.
Oh, it was fun. My pleasure. It was a fun time to be at SVA with those two.
Hmm.
You know, someone mentioned getting a book from Will Eisner. One of the highlights of taking Will's class was he started every class, he would bring in a big box. I guess, you know, Will would get books from around the world and he would bring them to class and give them out to the students. And I still have copies of, I think it was from Denmark, Crazy Cat books from Denmark that Will gave to me.
Speaking of time, I think we've run full here.
In other words, it's time to go. I just want to get one plug in. Dennis, quickly, you would somebody, maybe it was me, mentioned John Law, and I've heard there's a John Law book that.
Yes, Titan just published it. It's just out. It's Will's 1948 stories that was going to be published by his comic book company when he pulled the rug on it. And it's with added material by an Australian artist named Gary Shaloner that Will authorize to continue John Law. So yeah, it's fascinating. It's one of those big what if stories. What if Will had not pulled the plug so quickly in 1948 and John Law had become itself a separate series? But he was clever enough that he designed the characters so that he could fairly easily remove John Law's eye patch and change a few other details, and he conveniently became the Spirit. And the story that was John Law is one of the most classic stories of all time, even though no one picked it tonight, and that was the two-part Sans Serif story in January 1950.
Well, we had it in the Pfeiffer story about it was referenced in the Clifford is the Spirit story. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Patrick.
Are you gonna leave us empty-handed?
What do you mean?
The earlier joke?
Huh? I missed the whole joke.
Will earlier in the earlier anecdote you heard 5 minutes ago. Huh?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
anyway.
Good night, everybody.
Back to you, Paul. Back to you, Ben.
Yeah, see everybody on Thursday for the
Thursday we have the Pfeiffer
event. Yeah.
So come see that.
See you on Wednesday, on Thursday, Danny.
Mort Gerberg will be on that.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody.
All right.
Thank you, Danny.
Yeah, folks. Happy Will Eisner week.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Great job, Danny. Thank you.